Hello guys, welcome to a new chapter of the Empress Dowager Cixi. This is going to be chapter 22. To war against the Boxers. That the foreign legations took the side of her adopted son embittered the Empress Dowager, but she was more enraged by how the powers were treating her empire after she sought their friendship at the reception for the diplomatic ladies. Soon after she reached out and proclaimed "one family, all one family," she was dealt a nasty blow. At the beginning of 1899, Italy demanded the cession of a naval station on Shamnen Bay, a deep inlet on the east coast of Sijian province. This was not so much for some strategic reason as for Italy's desire to own a slice of China as a status symbol, to keep pace with other European powers. As this acquisition presented no threat to the powers, Britain gave Italy its consent, as did most of the others. Italian warships then staged a demonstration of the coast near Beijing. It and other powers expected China to fall to its knees at this threat of war, as had hitherto been the case. Robert Hart on China's side was pessimistic. The Italian ultimatum is in: China to say yes in 4 days or take the consequences. But this time there was a different boss. Westerners saw that to Italy's surprise, as well as that of everyone else, China returned a stubborn refusal. The Chinese Foreign Office sent back letters from the Minister of the Italian Legation, De Martino, unopened. It explained to Sir Claude MacDonald that it, being unable to accede to this request, and considering that to argue the point with the Italian minister would mean a great expenditure of pen and ink, returned to Signore De Martino his dispatches. Cixi gave orders to prepare for war. There was a bustle of activity throughout the empire, noted foreign observers. In the middle of the crisis, Italy changed the minister at its legation. When the new minister, Giuseppe Salvago Raggi, arrived, he presented his credentials to Emperor Guangzhou. Deviating from the protocol by which the head of the Foreign Office received the credentials on his behalf, Emperor Guangzhou stuck out his hand to take the letter, noted Salvaggio Raggi, whereupon Prince Qing froze. The Italians interpreted the emperor's hand as a very significant sign that China was going out of its way to be nice to them and that their gunboats had worked. They were deeply disappointed when Chinese officials arrived the following day to explain that what the emperor had done was only an anomaly, and that nothing should be read into it. On November 20 and 21, 1899, Cixi issued 2 decrees, in which she expressed her outrage and her resolve. Now the situation is perilous, and the powers are glaring at us like tigers eyeing their prey, all trying to barge into our country. Considering the financial and military situation in China today, we will of course try to avoid a war, but if our powerful enemies try to force us to yield to demands to which we cannot possibly consent, then we have no alternative but to rely upon the justice of our cause and to unite and fight. If we are forced into a war once the war is declared, all provincial chiefs must act together to fight those hateful enemies. No one is allowed to speak the word he, appeasement, and no one must use or eat or think about it. China is a large country with rich resources and hundreds of millions of people. If the nation can be united in its devotion to the emperor, what powerful enemy is there to fear? Italy, which in fact had no stomach for war, lowered its demands and eventually asked only for a concession in a treaty port. Cixi reportedly told the Italians, "Not a speck of Chinese mud." Italy climbed down and, by the end of the year, abandoned all its claims. A feeling of elation filled the hearts of patriotic Chinese. Westerners noticed, but the victory did not lessen Cixi's anxiety. She knew she was lucky, for Italy was a small and poor country and did not really want a war. It was only bluffing, and she called its bluff, but the support given to Italy by major European powers destroyed her one family illusion and deepened her bitterness. Foreign powers bully us too much, she kept saying. Foreign powers are ganging up on us, and I feel eaten up inside. Even the most open-minded and pro-Western members of the elite were enraged by the European powers' scramble for China. They were appalled that America, the only major power that did not take their territory, had introduced the Chinese Exclusion Act, discriminating against Chinese immigration. Almost everyone had endured injury to their personal pride. One, Wu Stingfang, who had studied law in London and had headed China's mission to the United States, was much hurt by one incident. Western people are fond of horse racing. In Shanghai, they have secured from the Chinese a large piece of ground where they hold race meetings twice a year, but no Chinese are allowed on the grandstand during the race days. They are provided with a separate entrance and a separate enclosure, as though they were the victims of some infectious disease. Jung Wing, the first Chinese to graduate from Yale University, described an experience in a Shanghai auction room which marked him deeply. I happened to be standing in a mixed crowd of Chinese and foreigners. A stalwart 6-footer of a Scotsman happened to be standing behind me. He began to tie a bunch of cotton balls to my queue, simply for a lark, but I caught him at it and in a pleasant way held it up and asked him to untie it. He folded up his arms and drew himself straight up with a look of the utmost disdain and scorn. The matter ended in a fight when Jung Wing's blows drew blood in great profusion from the Scot's lip and nose. The Scotsman, after the incident, did not appear in public for a week, but the reason was more on account of being whipped by a little Chinaman in a public manner. It was Jung Wing who initiated the scheme to send Chinese teenagers to America to educate them, while Wu Tinfang would in time become one of the drafters of a Western-style legal code. Both turned their heart into an impetus to reform China on the model of the West, for which they retain a lifelong affection and admiration. For the average villagers and small-town people, anti-Western feeling was mainly directed at the Christian missions established among them. By now there were more than 2,000 missionaries living and working in China. Being foreign, they easily became targets of hate when times were bad. The inflexibility of some priests did not help. Animosity arose particularly when there was a drought, which inflicted protracted agony on the peasants. At such times they prayed to the god of rain. But, this being a matter of life and death, was very important to them, so they were very angry when many Christian missions told them that they were praying to the wrong god, and they condemned their ceremonies as idolatrous theater. E. H. Howard, for 20 years a medical missionary in China, wrote, "It can scarcely be conceived by foreigners what a hold they have upon the people, and what immense sums are spent upon these ceremonies every year. These missionaries will then forbid their converts to pay their dues or to take part. As a result, when the drought was prolonged, villagers blamed the foreigners and converts for offending the god of rain and causing them starvation. When mandarins explained this to the priest, the answer was unyielding. As Edwards observed, the officials further asked the missionaries to urge the Christians to pay such dues in order to prevent future troubles. To this request there was, of course, but one answer, and it was further explained to the officials that attendance at theatres was not only discountenanced by the Protestant Church in China, but that if any member was found to frequent them habitually, he would be disciplined. Backed as they were by gunboats, the missions had become a competing authority. As such, they were able to protect their converts in numerous grassroots disputes. As a consequence, some non-Christians were convinced, justifiably or not, that the local officials would side always in the favor of Christians to avoid trouble for the government and their own career. Their sense of grievance sparked many a riot against Christians. Cixi's orders on dealing with disputes involving Christians were always to be fair and even-handed. Her own government clamped down on anti-Christian riots and punished officials who failed to exert sufficient force to quell riots. After Germany snatched parts of Shandong in late 1897 and established a significant presence there, many villagers converted to Christianity in order to receive protection. In a number of counties, as the local authorities saw it, people joined the church to avoid being punished for owing debts and not wanting to pay them back, committing robbery or even murder. And there was one man who sought the shelter of the church so that he did not have to answer a subpoena after his father had filed a lawsuit against him for being seriously disobedient. In one county, a Christian peasant was accused of taking wheat from his neighbor's field. In another, a relatively rich Christian, it was alleged, refused to lend grain to the starving during a drought. In both cases, as the local magistrates judged in favor of the converts, riots broke out that led to churches being burned. Yet another riot was triggered by Christians trying to turn a temple dedicated to the Celestial Emperor into a church. In spring 1899, in a bid to put an end to riots in Shandong, Germany sent an expedition into some villages. where the soldiers burned down hundreds of houses and shot dead a number of villagers. In the wake of these atrocities, a group that had been known for about a year as the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Feasts, the Yihe Quan, gained immense popularity and acquired hundreds of thousands of followers. This society blamed all the ills of the country and the hardship of their lives on foreigners, and vowed to drive them out. They were dubbed the Boxers by the foreign press. People joined the Boxers for many different reasons. Some hated the Germans that had destroyed their homes, or many other reasons, which included theft, the racism, unfair judgment, and so on. The Chinese is normally a well-fed person, these missionaries noted, and therefore we do not understand as to how, when there is little rain, they go so badly. When violence broke out against them, Cixi ordered the perpetrators arrested and punished severely, and the Christians protected. The governor of Shandong, Yuxian, hated Western powers and was unwilling to protect these Christians effectively. Cixi replaced him with General Yuan Shikai. Shortly after General Yuan's arrival in Shandong on December 30, 1899, the Reverend S.M. Brooks, a missionary of the Church of England, while traveling on a donkey on country paths, was murdered by a group of marauders who admired the Boxers. This was the first time in 2 years that a missionary had been murdered in China. An edict from Cixi declared that she was mostly deeply aggrieved and commanded General Yuan to catch the criminals and punish them severely. Yuan soon found the culprits and brought them to justice, some of them being executed. General Yuan also reported to Cixi that in that year the Boxers had destroyed 10 family houses used as churches, raided 328 Christian homes, and killed 23 converts. The general was determined to use force to suppress the Boxers, which Cixi endorsed, at the same time cautioning him that he must be extremely circumspect in taking large-scale military action. His aim must be to disband the gangs, punishing only those that had actually committed crimes. As Yuan conducted his campaign against the Boxers, they began to disperse, held by a much larger snowfall that lasted for days and promising a better harvest for the next year and a full stomach. However, some Boxers still became bandits, living on robbery and roaming around Sili province, which was close to Beijing. On 19 February 1900, Cixi banned the Boxers in Sili as well as in Shandong, ordering harsh punishment for anyone engaged in violence. Following a standard practice, the decree was copied out and pasted on the walls in the two provinces. The foreign legations which had found Cixi's edict about the Reverend Brooks murder soothing were dissatisfied with her ban on the Boxers. What they, mainly Britain, America, Germany, Italy and France, wanted was a nationwide imperial proclamation against the Boxers and any affiliated society, ordering by name their complete suppression. They demanded that it must be distinctively stated in the decree that to belong to either of these societies or to harbor any of its members is a criminal offense against the laws of China. They further insisted that the proclamation must be published in the Peking Gazette, the government news bulletin. Cixi declined to do as told. Apart from feeling defiant, she did not want to broadcast her ban to the whole empire, given that the Boxers only existed in two provinces. She would only ban the Boxers where they were active, Shandong and Sili. She would punish those who had committed violence and broken the law, but would not criminalize the average members. She especially loathed being perceived by the population to be heavy-handed, suppressing anti-Western sentiment, and hated to be taken for a puppet of the foreign powers. Besides, she felt the legation were being unfair and unreasonable. None of them had so much as raised a murmur against the offending German soldiers, while she was actively clamping down on the Boxers. Moreover, her approach was working. The Boxers in Shandong had largely been dispersed. The more the legation insisted on their demands, the more she dug in. No mention of the Boxers was made in the Peking Gazette. Sir Claude MacDonald, the British minister, wrote in frustration on April 2nd. I have never known the Chinese Foreign Office being so pig-headed or so pleased with themselves. He blamed the Italian backdown. Their ships came, looked and went away and their minister was recalled, the pigtails whining all along the line. What Sir Claude did not know was that Cixi would have acted the same way with or without Italy's debacle. On April 12, Sir Claude and his colleagues, whilst deciding not to press further for a special decree in the Gazette, gave the Chinese government 2 months to exterminate the Boxers. Otherwise, they threatened their forces would enter China to do the job themselves. This threat was backed up by an emphatic parade of gunboats outside the Dagu forts. Not wishing for a confrontation, Cixi made concessions. 2 days later, a memorandum from the Viceroy of Scilly described how the government troops were dispersing the Boxers was published in the Peking Gazette, thus announcing to the country that the Boxers were illegal. On the 17th, a decree was carried in the Gazette condemning those who make a pretext to oppress converts and involve themselves in crime. The legations read the translation. The throne sets no bounds to its principle of regarding all men with equal benevolence. Officials must take every opportunity of making it clearly known to all that every man must attend to its own business and live continually at peace with his fellow men. The decree did not mention the Boxers by name, and the tone was firm without being draconian. That these items appeared at all in the Peking Gazette pleased Sir Claude and his colleagues, but the lack of desired severity in the decree left them far from satisfied. The gunboats remained outside the Dagu forts, their presence sending a daily reminder that if Cixi did not wipe out the Boxers within 2 months, there would be an invasion. Western powers did not really want a war. As Miss Sarah Conger, wife of the American minister, wrote, none of them wished to get into war with China, but she also noted that there are many warships at Dagu. These were part of the bluff, but as Britain's Prime Minister Lord Salisbury later remarked, I have passed some time in trying to persuade my countrymen that bluffing with the Chinese was a dangerous amusement, but I did not anticipate such a very striking confirmation of my views. For Cixi, incensed, became more determined to defy the powers. Ever since China's disastrous war and peace with Japan 5 years earlier, a pattern had been established. Foreign powers will make demands, then threaten force, and Beijing would instantly do as it was told. Cixi had just broken the pattern by calling Italy's bluff. She was committed to doing the same with the other stronger powers. But if her challenge did lead to war, how and with what could she fight? The navy had been destroyed and the army was weak. Defeat appeared inevitable. It was at this point, in desperation, that Cixi clutched at a straw. Perhaps the Boxers would be able to fight a sort of people's war against the invaders. The Boxers' hatred for foreigners would make them fierce and courageous soldiers, she thought. Pragmatic men around Cixi like Zhonglu saw that a collision with the West was imminent and counselled accommodation with the legations in order to avoid it. Cixi turned a deaf ear. Fearing the worst, Zhonglu asked for sick leave and stayed away from the court for 60 days. Her confidant, whose sensible advice she usually heeded, was thus absent when Cixi made her most fateful decision. The man who had her ear now, Prince Duan, was the father of the newly appointed heir apparent. Hating Westerners for snubbing his son, he vehemently promoted the idea of using the Boxers as soldiers. He and other like-minded princes and aristocrats tried to convince Cixi that the Boxers were loyal, fearless and disciplined. They offered to organize the Boxers into a fighting force, prepared for invasion. Cixi's rational side told her that the Boxers were not remotely suited to such a conflict, but her emotional side desperately wanted to believe otherwise. They were her last resort. She may also have calculated that the Boxers could at least inflict some damage on the invaders, which could give her a chance to negotiate a compromise and so avoid a wholesale capitulation. As she tilted towards using the Boxers as soldiers, her hand that was striking at them became hesitant. Although the army continued to try to disband the Boxers, Cixi's half-heartedness and ambivalence were felt by the troops, whose own ardor slackened. The Boxers, emboldened, increased their ranks and spread like wildfire, right in the area around Beijing. In spring 1900, while Shandong was relieved by rainfall, the region surrounding Beijing was hit by a devastating drought. A contemporary missionary wrote, "For the first time since the Great Famine in 1878, no winter wheat to speak of had been planted. Under the most favorable circumstances, the spring rains are almost invariably insufficient, but that year they were almost whole lacking. The ground was baked so hard that no crops could be put in, and at such times the idle and restless population are ready for any mischief." Tormented by fear of starvation, the Boxers claimed that the god of rain was not answering their prayers because he was bewitched by the foreign devils, those inhuman creatures with blue eyes. As the Chinese have black eyes, the color of foreign eyes marked them out. There was a widely believed rumor that their multicolored eyes could see through the surface of the earth and spot underground treasures, which they proceeded to steal, leaving China poverty-stricken. In May, the Boxers, mostly peasants hit hard by the bad weather, entered Beijing and crowded the capital streets in their many tens of thousands. They wore red handkerchiefs, red shirts with a red sash around their waist, and they wielded large carving knives. Moving in gangs, they set up shrines worshipping a variety of deities, very often characters from popular theater like the Monkey King. In the course of a ceremony, the chief of the gang would act as though the spirit of the deity had entered him and thus making him and his words sacred. He would jump up and down, howling and acting wildly as if in a trance. Gestures that were also copied from Peking operas. Members recited meaningless incantations after him and they learned kung fu kicking. They were told that protecting spirits was now the center of their policy. Among them were some young women who called themselves the Red Lanterners and who had to be virgins or widows. Often carrying red lanterns as well as red tasseled spears, the women wore red tops with short sleeves and tight trousers and paraded themselves in the streets. All this was a breach of tradition, and they went all along with it. These handkerchiefs were said to possess magical properties. Place one on the ground and step on it, and a red lantern girl will be carried to the sky, as if in a theater, where she would locate a foreign devil's head and sever it with a knife. She could also dust a tall building such as a church with a handkerchief, and the building would be set on fire and reduced to ashes. These women, most of whom led downtrodden lives, were now enjoying their moment of liberation, not least seeing crowds of men prostrating themselves on the ground in homage when they strode by. On the walls in the Beijing streets, right next to the imperial edicts banning them, the Boxers' own eye-catching posters were defiantly displayed, calling for the killing of all foreigners in 3 months. On May 31st, as the situation was running out of control, Cixi gave permission for 400 Western troops to enter Beijing from Tianjin to protect the foreign legations. The legations did not feel this was sufficient, so on June 10th, more than 2,000 troops under Admiral Edward Seymour, Commander-in-Chief of the British Navy China Station, set off for Beijing from Tianjin, 120 kilometers away by railway. The expedition was not authorized by Cixi, who told her diplomats to persuade delegations to turn it back. The head of the Foreign Office, Prince Qing, was sympathetic to the coming of this foreign army, so Cixi in anger replaced him with the hardline Prince Luan. Delegations refused to turn back the expedition. Determined to halt a foreign army entering the capital unauthorized, Cixi endorsed the mobilization of some Boxers along the railway line in an attempt to stop it. The Boxers proved surprisingly effective. They thoroughly sabotaged the line and fought with the utmost courage, according to Captain Jellicoe, Admiral Seymour's chief of staff. Lieutenant Faunes Luttrell also remarked of the great bravery of the Boxers. Soon joined by the Imperial Army with modern weapons, they managed to hold back the Seymour expedition. This success raised Cixi's hope that the Boxers could indeed help repel invasions. The fighting heightened tensions in Beijing. On June 11, soldiers of a largely Muslim army defending the capital killed the chancellor of the Japanese legation, Sugiyama Akira, while he was out on the street. Cixi publicly expressed deep regret over the atrocity against a foreign diplomat and promised punishment of the perpetrators. But when she gave the order to the commander of the army, Dong Fuxiang, he replied that if one single soldier from his army were executed for the murder, his forces would mutiny. After a long silence, Cixi said, "Well, what's done is done." Supported by the Muslim army, the Boxers began to destroy railways, trains and telegraph lines. Telegraphic communication from Beijing to the provinces was broken, and the viceroys from the south had to send their cables to Shandong to be relayed to Beijing on horseback. In Beijing, the Boxers started to burn churches and foreign properties, cheered on by large crowds. In an act of extreme hatred, the mob raided foreign cemeteries, smashing tombstones and monuments, dragging out their graves and bodies, Foreigners were often referred to as Heiris, Mao Si, because they have more body hair than the Chinese. Chinese Christians were called secondary Heiris, Mao Si, and they bore the brunt of the Boxers' ferocity. With their bodies horribly torn and lacerated, they fled into the legations for protection. More than flesh and blood could stand to see, wrote a guard. Rescue parties were sent out in the hope of saving others, and they opened fire on the crowds, killing some 100 Boxers and other Chinese in a couple of days. Hatred overflowed. Frenzied men girt with red chassis and armed with swords, spears and knives crowded outside the legation quarter and laid siege to it. Home to the representatives of 11 countries, the legation quarter, an enclave roughly 3 kilometers long and 1.5 kilometers wide, was situated right next to the southern walls of the royal city, which cradled the forbidden city. The south of the quarter was bounded by the crenellated wall that separated the Manchu-inhabited inner city from the Han-inhabited outer city. A shallow canal running north and south roughly bisected it. Within the quarter, 473 foreign civilians and thousands of Chinese Christians took refuge with 400 military guards, who constructed a labyrinth of barricades. The Boxer crowds, numbering tens of thousands, surged against the walls and the defending cordon, shouting, "Kill the foreign devils!" Those who listen to the blood-curdling nocturnal yells will never forget the suggestion of a pandemonium, a rehearsal of hell, wrote the Reverend Arthur H. Smith. Cixi sent the pro-Western Yunglu now back from sick leave to lead his troops to protect the legation quarter. She issued many decrees intended to rein in the Boxers and dispatched grandees whom the Boxers seemed to trust to try and talk them into disbanding and returning to their villages. If they did not stop destroying railways, churches and foreign residences and stop assaulting and killing foreigners and Christians, then they would be subject to an extermination campaign by government forces. Meanwhile, Cixi cabled Earl Lee to come to Beijing to negotiate with the Western powers. The Earl at the time was the Viceroy of Canton, governing two coastal provinces in the south. Considering Cixi's handling of the Boxers to be inconceivably preposterous, he had been exchanging cables with other dignitaries daily to discuss what to do. Burning with impatience to help, he wished he could fly with wings to Beijing. But then, before he set off, events overtook all these efforts, as Cixi learned that scores of Western warships were gathering on the coast, and many more thousands of troops were on their way. Invasion seemed inevitable. Going to war meant gambling with the survival of the dynasty, and Cixi felt the need to be endorsed. On June 16, she convened a unusually large meeting of more than 70 participants, the grand councillors and ministers of the government, who were, it was strikingly noticeable, overwhelmingly Manchu and undistinguished. An eyewitness recorded the scene. In a packed audience hall, all attendants were kneeling before Cixi and Emperor Wangju, who were seated side by side. Prince Duan led a chorus of heated voices calling for the Boxers to be given legitimate status and to be used as a fighting force. But a few spoke against the idea, asking instead for harsher measures to suppress the mob. As one of them was talking, Prince Duan cut him short sarcastically. "Yours will be a very good way to lose the support of the people," at which point he stuck up his right thumb, as indicating it was a very good idea. When one attendant argued that the Boxers could not be relied on to fight a war, because much of their courage comes from the black arts which claim to shield them from bullets, Cixi herself replied indignantly, "It's true that such arts cannot be relied upon, but can we not rely on the heart and minds of the people? China has been weakened to an extreme degree, and all we have is the hearts and mind of the people. If we cast them aside, what do we have to sustain our country?" She proceeded to look furiously at those who persisted in arguing. That same day, something ominous occurred. In the busiest shopping district in Beijing, just outside the inner city and near the legations, the Boxers set fire to a pharmacy selling Western medicine and to other shops with foreign merchandise. As the flames leaped from store to store, devouring the best and rarest of silks, furs, furniture, jewels, antique art, and other of the empire's most beautiful artifacts, a spark flew onto the Qianmen Gate tower nearby. Rising more than 30 meters above the ground and nearly 15 meters above the wall on either side, this was the loftiest of all the busy city gates of Beijing. in the south of the central axis of the Forbidden City. The gate would only be open for the emperor when he went to pray at the Temple of Heaven or at the Temple of the God of Agriculture. The Boxers did not mean to destroy it, and, as it was consumed by the flames, they dropped to their knees to beg the God of Fire to spare his sacred edifice. The gate tower was soon reduced to a huge pile of smoldering charcoal and rubble, the biggest fire in the capital for more than 200 years. It terrified all who learned about the destruction, who regarded it as a deadly omen. Although she believed in omens, there was no retreat now for Cixi. On that very night, a joint force of 8 countries, Russia, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, America, Italy and Austro-Hungary, attacked the Dagu forts that guarded the sea entry to Tianjin and Beijing. After a fierce 6-hour battle, the forts fell. To Cixi, the fall of the forts was associated with an enduring heartache. 4 decades earlier, they had been seized by another allied Anglo-French army, which had led to her fleeing with her husband, who died of a bitter cold outside the Great Wall. The invaders had then burned down the old summer palace, leaving a vast ruin and a gaping hole in her heart. Ever since, it had been her dream to restore even a small part of the old palace, for which she had stolen from the navy and disobeyed heaven, and attracted severe denunciation. At the fall of the forts this time, nothing could stop her from fighting it out. War was anticipated on all sides. In Britain on that day, Queen Victoria wrote to Lord Salisbury, "Should be glad to hear your views on the state of affairs in China, which seem to me most serious. Also please say what you propose to do." From that day on, China telegrams in massive numbers were typed out and presented to the Queen, who sent out many messages, one of which read, "Feel anxious for personal safety of Sir C. MacDonald. Have you considered possibility of removal of foreign ministers from Peking? If one of them were killed, war will be inevitable." All the reformers who mattered to Cixi, Zhonglu, Earl Li, Viceroy Zhang, among others, were opposed to the war and to her policy. In the previous conflict with Japan, there had been numerous impassioned petitions urging fighting, but now they were missing. Many felt that the foreigners had reason to send in troops to protect their own people, who were not being properly protected by the Chinese government. "We are in the wrong, Li Q," Cixi was told. Grassroots officials wanted the mob suppressed, as they were harassed and terrorized by the Boxers, who demanded food and shelter and exacted revenge for past grievances. But Cixi had made up her mind. At another top-level meeting, she raised her voice and declared to the assembled dignitaries, "Our choice is whether to put our country on a platter to hand over to the invaders or to fight to the end. I cannot face our ancestors if we do not put up a fight. I would rather fight to the end. If the end comes, you gentlemen here are my witnesses and can testify that I have done my best." Her passionate words and unusual agitation made a great impact on all the present. They banged their heads on the floor, bowing to follow her. On June 20, soldiers of the Imperial Army shot dead the German minister, Baron von Ketteler, when she stepped out of the barricades to go to the Foreign Office. According to this biographer, Andrew Roberts, Lord Salisbury told Betty Balfour that von Kettler's death was poetic justice. Salisbury said, "It's all the fault of Germany, they began all this trouble." Then, as Queen Victoria had spelled out, if one of the ministers were killed, war would be inevitable. The next day, on June 21, Cixi declared war on all 8 invading foreign powers.